Hey, are you tired of the left and right politics? I hope you'll subscribe to my YouTube channel. Just click that subscribe button, ring the little bell, and prepare to free your mind from the traditional red versus blue. So, at long last, the so-called For the People Act seems like it's about to get a test run in the United States Senate next week. And I thought it was high time for us to do what exactly is it, the dummy version. I, of course, will play my role as dummy in chief. I've got the perfect expert to break it all down. That would be Stephen Spaulding, who wrote a great piece for Smirconish.com. You can access it on my website. His credentials include his current service as senior counsel for public policy at Common Cause, previously senior elections counsel in the House of Representatives Committee on House Administration, and special counsel at the Federal Election Commission. Stephen, thanks so much for being here. Thank you for writing that great essay for my website.
I appreciate it, Michael. Thanks for having me.
So, big picture version, what exactly is this and how long has it been in the pipeline?
The For the People Act, otherwise known as HR1 or S1, is transformative, comprehensive legislation that's designed to really bolster American democracy and elevate the voices of all Americans. There's really three pillars to this bill. The first roughly 300 pages is about protecting the freedom to vote. And those 300 pages were in large part authored by our late American hero, Congressman John Lewis. It's about setting basic national standards to access the franchise. So I think a lot of Americans, especially during the pandemic, became familiar with the fact that we really have, if you count Washington, D.C., 51 different state election codes that determine whether you can vote early, how you can vote by mail, whether you had to pay postage, whether you had to have it postmarked a couple days before the election or on the election. So that first 300 pages are about expanding access to the franchise. Things like automatic voter registration, online voter registration, vote by mail without having to pay postage for all who want it, secure paper-based voting systems. That's what's really incorporated in roughly the first third of the bill. It's setting those basic national standards. It also includes a provision to end gerrymandering by requiring states to adopt independent redistricting commissions that are in place in several states across the country, including California, and really setting standards for what is a partisan gerrymander. So that's the first roughly third of the bill. The second pillar of the bill is about breaking the grip of big money in politics. And it does that in a few ways. One, it sets up a new way for people to run for office and pay for political campaigns that's based on programs that empower small donors. We have systems like this in Maine and Connecticut. And this would set a system for congressional elections for people to run for office really based on small dollar donations that are matched. And it really breaks the grip of big money lobbyists and others who traditionally fund political campaigns. And it also includes the Disclose Act, which would shine a light on the $1 billion+ of dark money that has flooded our elections since Citizens United. In Citizens United, 11 years ago, when the court said that corporations apparently have a First Amendment right to spend money in elections, the court said, well, we're unleashing all this money, but it'll be disclosed. And so the anti-corruption mechanism to ensure that all of that money isn't corrupting is disclosure. Well, the laws have not kept pace with that. More than $1 billion has come through dark money groups that do not have to disclose their donors. This bill would fix that. And the third pillar of the bill is about strengthening ethical standards. For example, requiring the Supreme Court to adopt a code of conduct. It's the only federal court in the country that is not bound by a transparent code of ethics, by requiring appointees to administrations to abide by the strong ethics executive orders that Presidents Obama and Biden have put into place. It would, for example, prohibit members of Congress from sitting on for-profit boards, and it would even require a president and vice president to disclose their tax returns. Those are the three pieces of the bill that are all intertwined and that are all about really, in my view, amplifying the voices of everyday Americans.
So you referenced John Lewis. The so-called For the People Act is separate and distinct from the John Lewis Voting Rights Act. Am I right?
That is correct. So HR 1, the For the People Act, is about setting basic national standards. And what it would do is override the voter suppression laws that have been sweeping the nation at breakneck pace. So we've seen laws in Iowa, in Georgia, in Florida. It was stopped in Texas, but in many other places, more than 380 pieces of legislation to restrict the freedom to vote have been introduced at the state level. The For the People Act, this bill would assert Congress's authority under the Constitution to set the rules around voting for federal elections. So it would set those standards. But then the John Lewis bill is more prophylactic in nature. What that's doing is restoring the strength of the Voting Rights Act, which the Supreme Court in 2013 in the Shelby decision really gutted. That bill is about stopping states with a history of racial discrimination in voting from passing new laws going forward and enacting those laws until they are first what is called pre-cleared by the Justice Department or by a federal court. So the For the People Act sets the national standards, and the John Lewis bill is forward-looking and would stop racially discriminatory laws before they're enacted in jurisdictions with a history of racial discrimination.
Got it. And thank you for that. Somebody listening to this conversation thus far and saying to themselves, wait a minute, we run our elections locally. Wherein lies the authority of the federal government? You just made reference to the Constitution to do this. And if the For the People Act is establishing a framework for federal elections, then what happens when it's a municipal or state year and not a federal cycle year?
It's a great question. So what the Constitution says, and what this bill doesn't change, is that local jurisdictions, states and local jurisdictions, there's about 8,000 local jurisdictions that run our elections, will continue to run elections, but they will be for federal elections, which is Congress's authority is over federal elections, is to set those national standards. But states will still run the elections. The bill also provides quite a bit of funding. For example, $1 billion is authorized and $175 million every other year for the upgrading of voting equipment. So Congress has the authority in the elections clause, I believe it's Article 1, Section 4, to set those standards. It says states run elections, but Congress may at any time alter those regulations. As for municipal and local elections, that's true. Congress traditionally does not have the authority to necessarily set all of those rules and regs, but we've seen in other laws like the National Voter Registration Act, the so-called Motor Voter Law, the Help America Vote Act, it makes sense for local jurisdictions once they set these systems up for federal elections. In general, those same rules generally will carry over in local elections as well. At least that's how it's been in many other cases where Congress has stepped in and asserted its election authority. State and locals will generally adopt those provisions for their other elections as well, rather than set up two separate systems.
And where the subject matter here is the running of elections, and this is not budgetary in nature, reconciliation would not apply, and therefore it would be subject to a filibuster, a long-winded way of saying you need 60 votes, not 51.
Unfortunately, as we've seen over the past roughly dozen years, the filibuster has now become a routine part of legislating. And you're right, reconciliation, so far, we don't necessarily see a path towards reconciliation being a carve out from the filibuster rule. But there's a number of proposals on the table to get this bill across the president's desk. That 60 vote threshold, I think it's worth just mentioning, it's not in the Constitution. It was considered a filibuster, a supermajority requirement to pass legislation, was considered and rejected by the founders. Instead, they decided to preserve supermajority requirements for overriding a presidential veto, convicting on impeachment, ratifying a treaty, not passing legislation. And there's been a real movement across the country, including in the Senate. A number of senators who previously expressed a lot of skepticism have said they're sick and tired of it. Those are the words of Senator Amy Klobuchar last week. She is sick and tired of the constant gridlock and really minority veto, where consider the January 6th commission bill. it got, I think the vote was 53 or 54 to 35, and yet the 35 senators who voted no controlled the outcome and shut it down. It's not the way a democratic process is supposed to work. Even Senator Manchin, who has so far been quite resistant to filibuster reform, yesterday there was an article in The Intercept with leaked audio of a call that he had with some major donors to an outside organization where he expressed some openness to figuring out a way to not allow a minority to completely shut down the process, whether it's making it harder to filibuster, raising the cost of filibustering. He even expressed openness to lowering it from 60 to 55. Of course, the Senate lowered it from 67 to 60 back in 1975. So we're not just going to let one filibuster, shut this whole thing down on this issue or a host of others.
He's a key player in this. And I was going to mention that on June the 6th, in a West Virginia newspaper, he said, quote, "I believe that partisan voting legislation will destroy the already weakening binds of our democracy. And for that reason, I will vote against the For the People Act. Furthermore, I will not vote to weaken or eliminate the filibuster," which seemingly is at odds with the audio that you just referenced a moment ago. Here's what I understand with regard to Senator Manchin, just combing through a variety of news reports and things that he has said. So he's on board for some things and not for others. And I think with our remaining time, this is a really good illustration of what are the nuts and bolts of this bill. The 15 days continuous early voting, which is a key part of this, he's in for that. He's supportive of that. He's also supportive of automatic registration for those with driver's licenses, for Election Day being a national holiday, and for some of the financial disclosure requirements that you made reference to in the second component of the For the People Act. What he's not on board for, as I understand, is he wants states to continue to preserve the ability to verify people's identities. Can you speak to that issue?
Well, let me just say that 24 hours ago, many were calling this bill completely dead after that op-ed that he published came out. And yesterday he put out a memo, made it public, circulated it to his colleagues of kind of his position and his where he is on that. And that's the first word from him. And he's one of 100 senators, and his views will be taken very seriously. And as you said, there's a lot in the bill that he indicated his support for, and some changes that he would like to promote as the bill proceeds through process. On the topic of voter ID, we have seen states. It's not the concept of voter ID that I think a lot of people have objections to. It's that some states have required a very specific type of voter ID that many voters, disproportionately Black voters, voters of color, elderly voters, young people, may lack to vote. In North Carolina, after the Supreme Court gutted a core piece of the Voting Rights Act, they moved very quickly in adopting a monster voter suppression bill, which included a voter ID provision that, among other things, led a court to say was targeting Black voters with surgical precision. And that's the court's words, the surgical precision. So it's the type of ID that voters are required. The For the People Act includes a provision that says if someone lacks that specific type of ID that someone needs, they can still swear to their identity under a penalty of perjury, which if you break that law, that's a serious offense. So it's about the type of ID that voters are supposed to provide. Senator Manchin said he would like some sort of voter ID. He cited utility bills. Of course, there's pieces of the Help America Vote Act, which would require some first-time voters to provide that already. So we don't have a lot more language from him on what he means by that, but it's one of several items that are on the table to discuss. What I think is unacceptable is a type of voter ID that, again, many people lack and that is really keeping them out of the process.
I totally agree. I think it's entirely reasonable to request some form of identification so long as what you're requesting is the sort that people in whatever that community is typically have. One final subject, if I might. It's a complicated subject area, and I think you've done a great job of synthesizing a lot of information. I understand that Senator Manchin is also rejecting no excuse absentee voting, which matters a great deal to me because I live in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, and for a long, long time, you needed to be out of the jurisdiction, meaning to have an excuse in order to vote absentee. Never thought I'd see in my lifetime that would change, but thank God it did. I fully embrace this. And it's a shame that Senator Manchin is not buying into the idea that everybody ought to be able to vote absentee, regardless of whether they have, quote unquote, an excuse. Take my final 30 seconds and address that issue.
Well, it wasn't on his list yesterday, and so I think we need to hear more from him about why that wasn't on his list, but that's a core component of the bill. It was clearly critical in the pandemic for voters to have options to vote safely, whether that was voting by mail and not having to get a doctor's note, or in some states even go out and find a notary or several witnesses. So no excuse absentee voting, that seems to be a very basic element of a system that protects the freedom to vote. It's our system for overseas and military voters for a long, that's been the system for a long time for them. And for, as you said, voters in many, many states, that should be the law of the land. And we need to hear more from Senator Manchin, but already 49 other out of 100 senators support no excuse absentee in the bill as it exists now. And so I hope that will remain a core pillar of the bill as this continues through the process.
Stephen, that is a great briefing on the For the People Act, which is going to take center stage next week. And I really appreciate you giving us the benefit of your thinking.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it. Thanks, Michael.